think it's a bit broader than antitrust law. Okay. Competition law is saying, hey, it's not that we have monopolies or trusts, but they're almost going to get there. So let's put some roadblocks on the road to monopolization so we don't get to monopolies, right? So we don't get to trusts. And so I do think number one, public knowledge, has worked and thought extensively about these bills. We support the House legislation as well as the Senate legislation. And I think that's more of a game of politics, right? Of which ones are moving in which chambers and all those things. But in general, I do think that, innovation is really, I put that slide up there first about intellectual property because this is what the framers had in mind, right? This is American exceptionalism. It is that you compete to win, you compete to survive, right? And when we continue to allow markets to hasten towards monopolization, right, we're disincentivizing innovation. So a big market actor doesn't really have incentivization to continue, making new stuff, trying new products. And right, the ways that they're incentivizing might be anti-competitive, right? It might be, or the ways they are, in inventing things might be anti-competitive. I mean, when you're buying hundreds of smaller companies, right, to absorb them just to sit on the IP to deprive other people of it. Right. That's obvious that you're not using, right, your powers of merging and buying and vertical integration for good, right? You're using them to deprive your competitors in an anti-competitive way. So I do think the legislation is good. I also think it isn't responsive to other problems, right? Content moderation is a thing, but I query whether regulation should fix that or whether competition can fix that, right? If we had meaningful competition, more platforms, more than just one or two or four, right? And we could migrate to platforms that moderate content in the ways that we like, instead of letting senators or House members or a regulatory agency tell us what's appropriate. Why don't we just decide, right? Without stepping on First Amendment, people's rights to speech, rights to express themselves without government intervention. So I do think antitrust is one thing. These bills are doing something broader because, yeah, you can bring antitrust cases against these companies, but they may or may not work. But if you pass additional legislation, right, that captures that more nuanced anti-competitive behavior, okay, that's a case. Long answer, I'm sorry. So in one of the articles, one of the periodical materials I'm gonna give you guys in the PowerPoints, it's our vice president Harold Feld wrote a really long, couple 100-page book about this, and he talks about, could the FCC do it? Why would that be good or why would that be bad? Could the FTC do it? Maybe. Why would that be good? Why would that be bad? And one of the arguments that really leans him to saying, hey, both of them maybe could do it, but the best route to go is a new agency. One of them that I find really interesting is culture. And you would have to really be in DC and in the Beltway to know it, right? Each agency has its own culture, right? And has its own precedent of rules and regulations that it promulgates or things over time that it has, kind of first acted on, been the first mover on. So it's kind of absorbed by pattern and practice, maybe not explicitly legal mandate. Okay. But what we would want is, I think the FTC's view is a little too narrow, right? They do two main things: consumer protection and antitrust. Okay, cool, right? But platform economy, right? It's a little more nuanced than that. And that's why I started with definitions, right? I mean, these companies are operating in the same spaces. We identify them almost intuitively as being similar, but they're not, right? Some are social media platforms, some are online marketplaces, some are hardware companies, right? So there's a particular market position, how they straddle multiple markets at once, and how they behave in multiple markets over and over and over and over again in anti-competitive ways, for example. But it's that the fact that they are a platform, and I think Julie Cohen goes into this really interesting etymology of the word platform, right? This raised surface, a plateau, right? And there are these plateaus where we have certain conversations and certain exchanges and interactions on. And together, I think they're the way they function similarly and have this platform structure of being elevated in unique places of like massive exchange. That's the nexus by which you should create a new agency instead of trying to jam this into an old agency and pass appropriations, right? You got to hire new staff for this. And it's question, could you assign old staff to this? They're bringing old outlooks on a new problem. Or should you hire new people in a new agency to do new work and to work with these agencies where they overlap? So some people are advocating for a new bureau in the FTC. That's very common. We get questions all the time, why a new agency? But I think one of the more, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the more convincing reasons to me is culture and precedent, that this new agency wouldn't be tied to what the FTC said in 1980 or MAGMOS rulemaking, which is a very laborious, handicapped way that an agency makes rules. It's got to do all these findings and all this feedback and all this stuff. It's not resilient. So maybe you need to have a new agency that just verbatim from jump implements resilient regulatory practice as outlined by Marchand and Stevens. And that's what I'm thinking is why we don't want the old ones, we want a new one.
Great.
It does kind of loop back into Marchand and Stevens, and I can explain it differently to make this connection more explicit. So technology is moving too fast. And to try to regulate them before they come out, all this stream of technology is going to get caught in this bottleneck, right? There's another concern, what we call regulatory capture. It's when the heads of agencies or the regulators are really like working for industry in a way that isn't considering consumer needs and ultimate good of technologies and of the public well-being. And so that's another thing is like, we don't want this bottleneck because it's a natural market reaction. We've got a ton of money as a big tech company. We got a ton of power. This agency's hemming up all of our innovations. So what we want to do is just dig into the agency and glide our things through, right? You're almost incentivizing them to do something that's illegal, right? Because you are having this buildup of stuff that can't move until this person says yes. So you want to bribe the person to say yes to make sure they say yes, right? Using that term bribe very, very, not in the legal sense, but in the functional sense, okay? And so that's one issue. And that's why, and also consumers lose. Let's say there isn't regulatory capture and it's working as it works, but Congress and agencies work so slow, so much paperwork, so many hearings and stuff. So it's just consumers are going to be deprived of the benefit of the technology, right? Because it's just stuck. However, if you regulate things in an ex post facto way, let them out there with some light guardrails and rules, and then let's do some kind of regular interval checking up or oversight. What did you do? How could you have done it better? Where did these things go wrong at CITE and where can they be fixed, right? And I think that would come with some kind of what we call a safe harbor, right? Allowing them to let these technology tools out there as they get innovated and checked, but also staving some liability from them perhaps so that they can try things and fail. But when they do fail, there's got to be an immediate reaction by government, or government just looks ineffective and it's effectively unregulated, right? So I do think ex post approaches that think about resilience, right? That work in the iterations of regulation over time, letting things out there in the wild, is important in an interesting way to make sure that technology still moves, but you're not trying to regulate it before it gets out there. You're letting things flow, but you got a really good procedural mechanism in place to evaluate how they're being used and to make them better. That's my personal belief, I'll say, is that, yeah, like let's let's see what happens. Of course, we want all of the parties working. So we want public interest orgs, right? Thinking about the harms and flagging them for Congress. So it might be out there already, but Congress might say, hey, before we even get news about a scandal like this, public interest community has come to me, right, and said that, hey, this might be a concern. So we might want an agency to weigh in on like preemptively saying that you shouldn't do this, or Congress might pass some kind of piece of legislation quickly that says, hey, watch it when it gets to this area, but still allowing it to be used, right, and just modifying its use in the course. It's really just legal scholars trying to come up with a way to map, right? Like, okay, technology's moving in this direction, but what have been historically helpful ways and unhelpful ways? Look at them. Or what is the prism of possibility? And it's like twofold. You could regulate before it comes out, you could regulate after it comes out, you could regulate in a permissive way, you could regulate in a prohibitive way. And then mapping that in a way, it's like once you see it, right, Jen, you can't unsee it. It's like every piece of regulation can kind of fit in this block in its respective sector. And so it really is more of like a legal scholar's mode of understanding possible ways of acting. And it's a really brilliant way to rule out certain unhelpful regulatory ways. I think pretty much the article, and I might agree in most cases, technologies that are regulated ex ante stop progress, right? But there are some technologies that I will tell you that are so dangerous, okay, that they should not be on the streets, right? I know electric, no, it wasn't electric cars, it was autonomous vehicles was kind of in the ex post prohibitive, right? Like lower right circle or lower right corner of the box. You could also think of a world where autonomous vehicles were ex ante prohibited, right? Like they weren't allowed on the roads, or they may not want to be allowed on the roads in some senses until they've been vetted and checked so that people don't like die in accidents, so cars don't go rogue, so they don't get hacked. So I think, you know, one could be a platform, right? But even in platforms, they have so many different verticals and sub companies. Some of those verticals are producing services and goods that could be out there, you know, ex post, and we just figure it out as we go. Some are so egregious, so critical, so important that maybe they need to get vetted first. And let's think, for example, of refrain from the civil rights community has been Facebook and housing ads, right? And how the algorithm, right, discriminates and shows certain kinds of houses in certain neighborhoods to non-people of color, right? But then, you know, excludes or shows houses of a certain quality and caliber to this, you know, other group of people of color. And there's law that already exists, right, against housing discrimination. So that's just a blatant, right? Like Facebook should not have put that out there. They did ex post, it got, you know, prohibited, right? But we might think of algorithms that do anything with loan calculations or housing calculations, right? Where there is a precedent of, let's say, civil rights law. Maybe those things shouldn't be let out in the wild on platforms yet, right? Until they're ex ante, right, regulated or looked at. So it's just a really helpful framework. Unfortunately, it's not anything enshrined into law, but it's something that we can use, right, as scholars and advocates to think about how best to regulate a certain technology. I think it is a very like convergence middle ground talking point. But I would say government does work slow, and it's just a function of, right, like how we've always done it. We're kind of wed to tradition. And it's interesting because, you know, the government was functioning long before computers made decisions, right, easier. So even the government adopting technology and using technology to regulate and evaluate technologies, right, is new. But I think there is a movement toward this more reasoned approach, if I may use the term, to like sandboxing And but when we talk about, okay, there's a part of regulation where we're talking about the technology individually, right? Is it helpful or harmful? Do the benefits of this thing outweigh the costs or harms? If so, yes. If not, no. But there's also like competition concerns, right? Okay, the company's coming out with great stuff, but how they're coming up with the stuff is anti-competitive, okay? Right? So there's another layer of like the things you're regulating in tech is not just the tech itself that I think you can sandbox reasonably. There are some things that I don't think, you really got to have a rein on. If you're talking about harnessing nuclear energy in cars so that we aren't dependent on Russia anymore for oil, yeah, right. Everybody's got an atomic bomb on wheels. I don't think so. Okay, that's definitely not going to get sandboxed, right? But other technologies may be, but also let's eye on behaviors of companies may also need to get regulated, right? It's a form of regulatory capture, right? Where you're just absorbing all of the time and attention and regulatory ire on you and your competitors and not consumers, right? I think that is a way of capturing agencies, distracting them with this thing while you go over here and do something else, vertically integrate or do other things. And, if we take, right, Frances Haugen's recommendation about a digital agency full of Facebook employees, that's not the PK view. I mean, that's regulatory capture by design. Okay.
Right,
I don't
right,
think
right.
so. Right. So if I do believe that a digital regulator can be created in a way learning lessons from the FCC and the Telecom Act. I mean, they're very much at the forefront and the background of how public knowledge has written this very long idea of what a digital regulator should do. But I do think if Congress mandates in its statute its public interest mandate, and what the FCC hasn't really successfully been able to do is from administration to administration force whoever's the chair or whoever the commissioners are to do what the public interest mandate requires it to do, right? And there are specific examples about media ownership and women and minority owned media outlets, right? That those market dynamics should be reviewed every quadrennial review. They're not. I mean, they've been in court 3 times, Prometheus 1, 2, and 3, arguing about not wanting to collect the data for 20 years instead of just collecting it, right? And so I
Yep.
do think if Congress writes in a statute that the public interest mandate isn't just flowery language, right? It has to have some operationalized and iterative and substantive, right? Like requirements. You're going to make an agency, no matter what administration it's under, do what they're supposed to do for the public, not just right entities. And I also think that competition lens is important. Right. I think we know we get the best results when we have the most competition, right? There's, so many market actors, their products are very similar, but they also innovate quicker because they're trying to beat the next guy. It drives costs down for consumers, et cetera. I think the FCC got hoodwinked into stopping at breaking up the bills or stopping at 4 is enough, 3 is enough big companies. There should be a lot more, and a telephone is not like a digital platform, right? There should be way more than 5. So how can we promote those actors? And I think an agency that leans always toward being pro competition, always towards smaller and medium-sized companies getting a chance to stay in the fight will kind of stave off that big company versus big company sucking up agency time and ire. That's a start. We'd have to have a deeper discussion about what bill text would say starting this agency. But thank you, John. No, that's a real question, especially as we're in Ukraine now. I think this is a watershed moment. I actually taught a course last week about big tech in Ukraine. And we see every day just getting flooded with these good news, feel good stories about how Google, Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, all these companies are helping the US government really fight this opponent, minimize misinformation, right? And it's like this perfect nexus of ideas and of
Mhm.
circumstances that really create an argument for them to, oh, don't regulate me, see what good I can do. But I think regulators can walk and chew gum at the same time. Right, like I can also applaud you for what you're doing in a in a wartime scenario, and like you are saving lives and documenting important evidence that will be used at criminal trials later. Right, I talked in the lecture about content moderation and how over moderating does two things, which we saw done last week. It could delete um, really important evidence of war crimes, right? Uses of illegal munitions. That'll be really, really important in the ICJ. Facebook evidence was seminal to the ICJ's ruling in the Myanmar genocide case, where people used Facebook to radicalize a population into legitimizing the mass extermination of Muslims in Myanmar in like 2016-17. So like this is also not social media companies' first rodeo with war. I talked about like Arab Spring and like the ISIS problem of recruiting and like ways in which platforms were like the heroes or like the pseudo cops, which is kind of problematic in some senses, right? Or the villains, right? Ignoring things happening on their platform, like in Myanmar. So, but I say all that to say, right, one of the content moderation concerns is over moderating so that important stuff gets lost, right? Important evidence of war crimes. And number two, pissing off Russia, where they cut off, right, these platforms for their citizens. So the citizens can't organize rallies and challenge government action and get new information to challenge propaganda. And we saw that happened anyway, right? Once news was breaking about tech companies helping the US government and they shut them off. And but there are other platforms, and that's why you want competition, right? Russia should not just be able to shut off like Facebook and like kill protests, right? And kill the ability for people to communicate. There should be other platforms, right, that people can hop to keep them guessing, right? Where are people communicating? And there's talks about other platforms and encryption sites that they're using to communicate. So, I mean, first, your question, John, is just a strict question about the extraterritoriality of US law. Yeah, we can't do that, right? We can't regulate, something outside the country that's happening with the US tech company necessarily. There might be some weird extraneous case where maybe you can. But we do know that what we do in this country does affect the world, right? Europe right now, I mean, has our major companies, right, in their crosshairs of regulation. I believe some of that is because they want their domestic tech companies to be able to compete, right? So even their like pro competition lens is for a very economically protectionist back front. Okay, is some of what I believe. So I do think though that the best way to win is to compete and to continue to create this bubble of American exceptionalism. And I don't want to get nativist and nationalist, but I do think in US jurisdiction, in US laws, we can incentivize new companies to challenge the technologies of today. And we will only continue to create the best technologies when we continue holding, big companies' feet to the fire with regulation to allow other people a chance to thrive, right? We win when we compete, and we've got to incentivize people to compete and not just sit on their wad of cash and spoon feed us updates.